"You proposed to the wrong sister?" Nora said, holding the ring up between two fingers like it might detonate if she moved too fast. Her voice caught somewhere between laughing and crying in front of 11 relatives who had all gone completely silent around the dinner table. I stayed on one knee, looking up at her, and told her the only thing that had ever actually been true in that room for the last 6 years. I told her I'd known exactly whose name was on that box the entire time. To understand why half my family gasped and the other half looked like they might actually pass out. You have to go back 13 years, to the summer I fell in love with the wrong sister first, and spent most of a decade quietly, carefully, guiltily falling in love with the right one instead. My name is Theo Bennett. I grew up in the house next door to the Callahan family, close enough that our backyards shared a single broken fence neither family ever bothered fixing. Close enough that I basically had 2 extra parents and 2 almost sisters of my own from the time I was 7 years old. Elise Callahan was a year younger than me, loud and magnetic in the way some people just are. The kind of person who made every room feel like something was about to happen. Nora Callahan was 2 years older, quieter, sharper in a way that took longer to notice, the kind of person who read the room fully before she ever said a word in it. When I was 17, Elise and I started dating, the way 2 kids who've grown up next door to each other sometimes do, more out of proximity and comfort than any grand romantic awakening. It was easy and warm and exactly as uncomplicated as first love is supposed to be. We dated for 2 years, through the last stretch of high school and into our first year of college, and everyone on both sides of that broken fence assumed we were the kind of young couple who'd eventually get married in someone's backyard and never really leave the neighborhood at all. We broke up the way a lot of first loves end, not with a fight, but with a slow, mutual realization that we'd grown into different people than the 2 who'd started dating at 17. Elise wanted to move to a city and chase a career in event production. I wanted to stay close to home, closer to my father, who'd just been diagnosed with the early stages of a condition that made me want to be near enough to help. We ended things gently, over a long conversation on her parents' porch, both of us crying a little, both of us relieved underneath the sadness, both of us certain we'd stay close as friends because our families were too intertwined for anything else to make sense. What I didn't expect, in the 2 years that followed, was Nora. She'd always been around. The quiet older sister who used to drive Elise and me to the movies before either of us had a license, who used to sit at the kitchen table doing homework while Elise and I watched television in the next room, present in the particular unremarkable way that people are before you suddenly notice them completely differently. After Elise and I broke up, Nora was the one who checked in on me, not out of any romantic intention, just the plain decency of someone who'd watched me grow up and didn't want to see me struggling alone through my father's diagnosis, while also nursing a quiet heartbreak. She started coming by on Sundays, bringing coffee, sitting with me while I did research on treatment options, asking my father blunt, practical questions doctors sometimes forgot to explain clearly. She had a way of making hard things feel manageable just by breaking them down into their smallest possible pieces. I remember the exact evening it shifted for me, 8 months after the breakup, sitting on my parents' back porch, while Nora explained patiently why the specialist my father wanted to see actually wasn't the best option, cross-referencing insurance details and second opinions with the same calm precision she brought to everything. I looked at her mid-sentence and felt something rearrange itself in my chest that had absolutely nothing to do with grief and everything to do with the particular, specific way she tucked her hair behind her ear when she was concentrating. I panicked immediately. Not because the feeling itself was confusing, but because of exactly who it was attached to. Elise was still my ex-girlfriend. Nora was still her sister. Our families still did Sunday dinners together, still spent every 4th of July on the same shared stretch of lawn between our 2 houses. Falling for Nora felt, in that first flooded moment of realizing it, like a betrayal of a friendship I still valued deeply, a violation of some unspoken rule about which Callahan sister I was allowed to have feelings for. So I did the only thing my 20-year-old brain could think to do. I buried it, completely, deliberately, for a very long time. I want to tell you that burying a feeling that big actually works. It doesn't. It just goes quiet for a while, resurfacing at inconvenient moments like the year Nora dated a marketing consultant named Aaron for 14 months. He was perfectly pleasant, The kind of steady, unremarkable good guy nobody could reasonably object to, and I hated him with an intensity that embarrassed me every single time I felt it. I found myself inventing reasons to stop by the Callahan house on nights I knew he'd be there, borrowing tools I didn't need, returning dishes that could have waited, just so I could sit in the same room feeling something I refused to name even to myself. I remember one particular Sunday watching Erin laugh at something Nora said, watching her lean into him the way she used to lean into conversations she actually cared about, and excusing myself to the bathroom simply to stand in front of the mirror for 5 minutes, reminding myself I had absolutely no right to feel what I was feeling. Or the year I dated a woman named Priya for almost as long, someone kind and lovely who eventually told me, with more patience than I deserved, that she always felt like she was competing with someone I never talked about, and she was tired of losing to a ghost with no name. She wasn't wrong. I'd spent the better part of our relationship comparing every quiet Sunday afternoon with Priya to the quiet Sunday afternoons I used to spend with Nora researching my father's treatment options, and no amount of genuine affection for Priya ever quite closed that gap. I ended things with her as gently as I knew how, and drove home that night feeling like the villain in a story I hadn't even had the courage to admit I was the main character of. She was right, and I didn't have the courage to tell her who the ghost actually was. Elise, meanwhile, had moved to the city just like she'd planned, built the career she wanted, and eventually met a man named Marcus at a conference, an easy, warm, unremarkable kind of good match that made everyone who loved her breathe a private sigh of relief. When she got engaged 3 years after our breakup, I felt something loosen in my chest that I hadn't let myself examine too closely until that exact moment. Some quiet, cowardly part of me had been waiting, without admitting it, for Elise to build a life fully separate from mine before I let myself feel anything real for her sister. Her engagement wasn't the reason I loved Nora, but it was the reason I finally let myself stop feeling guilty about it. Even then, I didn't say anything. Years of careful silence don't just dissolve because the guilt technically clears. I'd built an entire architecture of behavior around not wanting this, joking about Nora like she was simply a good friend, deflecting my mother's occasional pointed comments about how much time Nora and I spent together, telling myself the friendship was enough, that risking it for something more wasn't worth the possibility of losing her entirely if she didn't feel the same way. The turning point came almost by accident. The year Nora got a job offer in another state, a genuinely good opportunity in her field that would have meant relocating 600 miles away. She told me about it on the same back porch where I'd first felt the shift 8 years earlier, and watching her talk through the pros and cons with her usual careful precision, I realized with a kind of physical panic that I could not simply nod along and wish her well this time. Some things you can survive losing without ever having tried for them. I understood, sitting there, that Nora moving away wasn't one of them. I still didn't tell her the whole truth that night. I only told her carefully that I hoped she wouldn't take the job. And when she asked why, in that direct way she asks everything, I told her it was because I didn't know how to imagine my life without her nearby, which was true, and also considerably less than the whole truth, which I still didn't have the courage to say out loud. She turned the job down 2 weeks later. She told me it was mostly about staying close to our aging parents, both hers and mine, and I let myself believe that explanation, because it was easier than hoping for the one I actually wanted. The months after that were the hardest and best of the entire 13 years. We started spending time together that had nothing to do with family obligation or convenient proximity. Dinners that were just the two of us. Long weekend hikes. A habit of texting each other during the day about nothing important that somehow felt like the most important part of my day regardless. Neither of us named what was happening. I think we were both terrified that naming it would either force a confession neither of us was ready for, or worse, reveal that only one of us was actually feeling it. The night everything nearly came apart was a Tuesday, unremarkable in every other way, when Nora, 3 glasses of wine into an evening at my apartment, asked me directly whether I'd ever really gotten over Elise, or whether some part of our closeness these past few years was actually about staying near a version of my old relationship I wasn't ready to let go of completely. I told her the truth. Finally, all of it, 6 years too late by any reasonable accounting. I told her I had loved Elise once, simply and completely, the way you love a first relationship, and that love had ended cleanly and fully years earlier. I told her that everything I'd felt since then, every Sunday afternoon, every panicked jealousy over Aaron, every guilty year of silence, had only ever been about her, Nora, specifically and completely, and that I'd spent 6 years being too cowardly to say so because loving your ex's sister felt, for a long time, like breaking some rule nobody had ever actually written down. Nora didn't say anything for what felt like an unbearable length of time. Then she told me she'd assumed for years that I still saw her as Elise's older sister first and a person second, that she'd built her own careful silence around not wanting to complicate the one friendship that had gotten her through some of her hardest years, that she'd turned down the job partly for our parents, and partly, if she was honest, because the thought of 600 miles between us had felt unbearable in a way she hadn't examined closely enough to name either. We didn't have some cinematic kiss that night. We just sat there, both of us finally saying true things out loud after years of careful silence, and something between us settled into a shape neither of us had allowed it before. We dated quietly for 8 months after that, deliberately keeping it from both families, partly to protect the relationship from everyone else's opinions while it was still new and fragile, and partly, I think, because some old guilt still lingered about how this would look to Elise. Even though Elise herself, when we finally told her, laughed and said she'd suspected it for at least 3 years and had simply been waiting for us to catch up to what everyone else already knew. Which brings us back to that Thanksgiving table. 11 relatives, a turkey, nobody had finished carving, and a ring box I'd been carrying in my jacket pocket for 2 weeks, waiting for the right unremarkable moment to become the right remarkable one. The plan in my head had been simple. Wait until after dinner. Take Nora outside to the same back porch where all of this had actually started. Propose quietly, privately, away from an audience neither of us particularly wanted for a moment this important. What actually happened was considerably less controlled. Nora's mother, midway through dessert, made an offhand joke about how she hoped somebody in this family would get engaged before she was too old to dance at the wedding, looking directly at Elise and Marcus, who had been dating 3 years without a ring yet. Elise laughed and said something about Marcus needing to hurry up, and in the warm chaos of everyone laughing along, I felt the ring box in my pocket suddenly weigh about 400 pounds, and some reckless, finally brave part of me decided the unremarkable moment had just become exactly remarkable enough. I stood up. The table went quiet the way tables do when someone stands up unexpectedly during dessert. I saw Elise's face light up, clearly assuming, along with apparently everyone else at that table, that I was about to say something to Marcus about finally proposing, some supportive joke or blessing. I saw my own mother's hand fly to her mouth, already assuming the same impossible thing everyone else seemed to be assuming. That whatever this was about to be, it would somehow involve Elise, because for 13 years, in the quiet architecture of everyone else's assumptions, Elise and I had never fully stopped being the couple this family expected. I walked around the table instead, past Elise, past Marcus, and got down on one knee in front of Nora, who went very still, her fork frozen halfway to her mouth, disbelief and something else entirely moving across her face all at once. That was when she said it, holding up the ring after I'd barely finished the first sentence of what I'd planned to say, half laughing, half in shock, her eyes already filling. "You proposed to the wrong sister." I told her the truth I'd been building toward for 6 silent years. "I've known exactly whose name was on that box the entire time," I said. "It was never Elise. It hasn't been Elise in a very long time. I bought this ring 3 months ago, and I've been terrified every single day since then that I'd lose my nerve before I got to say this out loud in front of everyone who ever assumed I already knew which sister I was supposed to love. Somewhere behind me, I heard Elise let out a sound that was half laugh, half sob. The sound of someone who'd apparently known this was coming for years and had simply been waiting, patiently, for the rest of the family to catch up. "I told you," Elise said to her mother, voice thick with tears and laughter at the same time. "I told you 3 years ago it wasn't me anymore." Nora was still staring at me, ring held between 2 fingers. The whole table frozen around us in the particular kind of silence that happens when a room full of assumptions gets rearranged all at once. "You knew," Nora finally said, quieter now, "just for me, this whole time, every Sunday. Every year I dated Aaron and you sat there being weird about it and I thought I was imagining things. You knew exactly what this was the entire time. I knew, I said. I was just a coward about saying it for longer than I'm proud of. But I'm not being a coward about it right now. I love you, Nora, not as Elise's sister, not as the girl who used to drive us to the movies. Just you, specifically, completely, for longer than I've had the courage to admit out loud until this exact, extremely public moment. She laughed then, a real laugh, wet and disbelieving, looking around at the entire table of relatives who were all, at this point, either crying, laughing, or some confused combination of both. You couldn't have done this privately? On the porch, like a normal person? I had a plan, I said. Oh, your mother's dessert joke ruined it. I panicked and went with the version where everyone I love gets to watch. That's insane, she said, still holding the ring up like she hadn't quite decided what to do with it yet. Say yes, I said, and I promise the rest of our life can be considerably less public than this exact moment. She looked at the ring, then at me, then briefly, at her sister, who nodded through her tears like she was giving some kind of long overdue blessing neither of us had actually needed but both of us were grateful for anyway. Yes, Nora said, and the whole table erupted into the kind of noise Thanksgiving dinners are supposed to have. Chairs scraping back, someone's champagne glass nearly toppling, my mother already crying into a dish towel, Elise coming around the table to hug us both at once, saying something into my shoulder about it being about time. 6 years being a genuinely embarrassing amount of time to sit on something this obvious. We got married the following autumn, on that same shared stretch of lawn between our two childhood houses, the broken fence finally, symbolically, taken down for the occasion. My father, steadier by then than he'd been in years, walked the length of that lawn without his cane for the first time in longer than any of us could remember, insisting he wasn't going to let a diagnosis keep him seated for this particular afternoon. Elise stood beside Nora as her maid of honor, and gave a toast that started with the line, I dated the groom first, and honestly, this is the best possible outcome for everyone involved, which got the loudest laugh of the entire reception. Marcus, standing beside her by then with a ring of his own on her finger, leaned over at one point and told me quietly that he'd always assumed there was history there. He wasn't fully briefed on, and was relieved to finally have the full story, instead of the half-explained tension he'd been politely ignoring for 2 years. If you've ever loved someone you weren't supposed to love, for reasons that made sense on paper and none at all in your actual heart, you understand exactly what those 6 years of silence cost me, and exactly what it felt like to finally say the truth out loud in front of everyone who assumed they already knew how this story was supposed to end. Nora still teases me, sometimes about proposing in front of 11 relatives instead of quietly on the porch like I'd planned. I tell her the same thing every time. Some truths, once you're finally brave enough to say them, don't want to stay quiet a single moment longer than they have to. We still do Sunday dinners at the Callahan house, Elise and Marcus included, and every so often my mother-in-law brings up that Thanksgiving, laughing about the exact expression on my face when I stood up expecting the table to already be looking somewhere else. Nora likes to remind me that the broken fence between our two houses stood unfixed for over 20 years before anyone finally bothered taking it down, and that maybe some part of both of us had been quietly hoping, long before either of us said it out loud, that the gap between our two families was never really meant to stay closed off for good.